In just 47 seconds of chilling silence, Jasmine Crockett shattered the mask of Vice President J.D. Vance on live television. It all began with a Pentagon strike that left 11 bodies floating in the Caribbean, a strike Vance called the best use of our military. The chamber gasped. 30,000 American families mourning, fentanyl victims demanded answers, and the vice president froze under Jasmine's relentless fire. This wasn't politics. It was a political earthquake, a fight for the soul of justice. And now the question burns. When leaders stay silent as lives are lost, what does that silence reveal about power? And what does it demand of us? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The red light on the studio camera goes live as sirens slice through the broadcast and the anchor's voice hardens. Breaking now, Pentagon confirms a precision strike on a Venezuelan drug boat in the Caribbean. The screen fractures into satellite footage, a jittering zoom of dark water and a fast vessel before a flash swallows the frame. A chyron detonates across the bottom. 11 dead in Caribbean strike. VP Vance defends action. In a quiet office across town, Jasmine Crockett stands motionless in the glow of 3 televisions, their audio out of sync, the word strike can dead ricocheting like spent casings. For one suspended breath, even the city traffic seems to stall. On cable panel after panel, voices firing counterpoint. Some fist pump the decisive blow against the cartels, others flinch at the phrase rules of engagement. A radio caller sobs that her brother was stopped and searched 3 times this month because of his accent. Another caller thunders that it's about time we fight back. Hashtag split like fault lines. Hashtag protect America spikes alongside. Hashtag do process no. Jasmine's staff phones vibrate in a staccato dance on her desk, lighting up with texts from community leaders, veterans, mothers. Outside, a storm crowds the horizon. Inside, the storm is already here. Producers yank the feeds tighter. An overhead map of the Caribbean. A blinking trajectory line. A grainy still that could be a boat, a blur, a body. Officials say the target was tied to a powerful transnational gang. The anchor intones, while the chyron refuses to look away from the number 11. No names. No ages. Just arithmetic. Jasmine rubs her temple and exhales through her nose. To move she uses, when fury needs a leash, she reaches for a legal pad and writes 2 words in block letters. What authority? Then the clip everyone reposts hits like a hammer. Vice President J.D. Vance's viral post splashed full screen. Killing cartel members is the highest and best use of our military. A beat later, the second sentence falls colder. I don't give a damn what you call it. Studio guests stop mid-sentence, as if an invisible hand squeezed the room. The audio engineer in Jasmine's office mutters, "Did he really say that?" Jasmine doesn't answer. She's already rolling her chair to the bookshelf where a thin constitution waits like a match. Civil rights groups beam in via split screen, their leaders clutching folders swollen with affidavits and names. This isn't a policy, it's a precedent. One warns, eyes rimmed red. On another feed, a pastor from a port city says his congregation includes dockworkers who've watched search and seizure become search and shatter. A public defender wipes his glasses and says the quiet part loud. If we normalize extrajudicial force abroad, we will excuse it at home. Jasmine underlines extrajudicial until the paper dents. The counterpunch comes from a former narcotics agent who insists the cartels are war-level actors and that hesitation kills. A retired admiral urges clarity of mission, but his gaze drifts when pressed on legal footing. A commentator cheers the strike as a message, then sidesteps the messenger's oath. The chyron refuses to blink. 11 dead. Jasmine's phone buzzes again. This time, it's a community clinic director texting a photo of a waiting room packed with grieving families who don't yet know what they're grieving. In the studio, the anchor pivots. The White House stands by the operation, citing imminent threats. The phrase stands by hangs in the air like smoke that won't rise. An analyst mentions the Coast Guard's usual jurisdiction, then clears his throat and looks off camera, as if someone just slid a note under the door. On social, a thread begins to trend. Screenshots of maritime law, snippets of AUMF debates, and a looping clip of ocean foam where a boat used to be. Jasmine writes a second line beneath what authority, whose orders. She thinks of families in church basements who bring coffee to vigils that last too long, of parents who have held up photos of their sons at hearings until their arms shook. She thinks of the oath she swore, the one that wraps itself around the word defend like barbed wire around a fence post. Her chief of staff steps into the doorway, mouth a thin line. "You're wanted for comment 10-5. Jasmine nods, shuts off one television, then another, leaving a single screen where the chyron still throbs. The number does not change. Across the city, sirens pulse again, not from police cars, but from phones' amber bars of alert banners. Newsroom blasts, calendar pings moving meetings from later to now. In the crawl of a local station, a mother's statement ticks by. "We came to America for law, not luck." A veteran calls in to say the uniform means nothing without the rule of law beneath it. Jasmine slips the pocket constitution into her blazer and feels its thin weight steady her spine. The window begins to spit. The camera finds her as she steps into the corridor's hard white light, and the sound engineer counts down from 3, then 2, then 1. Her eyes lock with the lens the country on the other side, and she inhales once, deeply, as if drawing a line she will not cross and cannot allow to be crossed. Words gather behind her teeth like a tide ready to break, and as she leans toward the microphone, a question rises above the nose, the numbers, and the fire. Is this justice, or the start of something darker? The chamber lights blazed white as Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat, the Constitution tucked like a blade in her hand. Cameras locked on her face, sharp, unwavering, illuminated by the fury of someone who had watched too many lines crossed. She didn't wait for permission. "This isn't just about Venezuela," she declared, her voice cutting through the marble air. "It's about who we are as a nation. If we normalize murder without law, then tomorrow, it's not a foreign boat, it's our own democracy that sinks." Murmurs surged across the room, a restless tide of shock and recognition. J.D. Vance leaned back in his chair, a smirk curling as if he had been waiting for the chance to strike. "Here she goes again," he said loudly enough for the microphones to catch, "defending criminals instead of Americans. Maybe you'd like to offer the cartels a warm welcome and a lawyer, too." The chamber rippled with gasps. Jasmine didn't flinch. She snapped back, every syllable like a crack of thunder. "I'm not defending criminals, Mr. Vice President. I'm defending the Constitution, the same document you swore to uphold before you spat on it with that reckless tweet." The words landed hard. For a moment, even Vance's grin faltered. Then another voice cut through the tension, unexpected, sharp. Senator Rand Paul leaned forward, fingers steepled, his Kentucky drawl steady as a gavel. "J.D., she's right. When you brag about killing without trial, you don't just disgrace the office, you disgrace every soldier who ever fought believing America stood for something better than a firing squad." Heads turned, startled at the rare alignment of Paul and Crockett. The moment dripped with irony. A libertarian senator and a progressive congresswoman, united by the simple demand that law must mean something. Captain Miller of the Coast Guard cleared his throat, his uniform gleaming under the lights. His voice was disciplined, but there was a tremor beneath. "For decades, it has been our job to interdict narcotics at sea. We board, we seize, we arrest, and we turn suspects over for trial. That's the chain of command. That's the law. But this strike bypassed us entirely. I've served 25 years, and I've never seen anything like it." His testimony dropped like a stone into water, ripples of unease spreading through the chamber. Then came Dr. Elena Ruiz, sharp high, with folders of precedents stacked high beside her. She lifted one document, her voice crisp and surgical. "There is no authorization for use of military force that covers extrajudicial killings of alleged smugglers." The War Powers Resolution was ignored. International law was shredded. "If this action stands unchallenged, we will have set a precedent that any president or vice president can kill first and invent the legal rationale later." The air seemed to tighten. Even seasoned staffers shifted in their seats, as if realizing the weight of what had just been said. Vance tried to laugh it off, but it sounded brittle. "Lawyers, professors, and politicians always too weak to face the real world. You hide behind paper while families bury their dead from fentanyl. I'm the one willing to pull the trigger to protect America." Jasmine's reply was cold steel. "And I'm the one willing to say America doesn't need a trigger-happy tyrant in a suit calling himself vice president." The words hit like a gunshot. The audience jolted, the press gallery erupted in whispers, and Vance's face stiffened as though struck. Jasmine let the silence stretch, her gaze drilling into the cameras, her voice lowering to a dangerous calm. "When the Vice President of the United States says law doesn't matter, who will stand up to him? The decision came down like a thunderclap. Congress would convene a nationally televised hearing to question Vice President J.D. Vance over the strike that left 11 dead in Caribbean waters. The announcement sent shockwaves through the country. For the first time in years, Americans who usually tuned out politics stopped in their tracks, their eyes glued to screens, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and fury. Cable networks lit up countdown clocks, anchors promised the clash of a generation, and whispers spread that this hearing could redraw the line between democracy and despotism. While Washington prepared its stage, Jasmine Crockett moved in the shadows of grief and resilience. She stepped into community centers, where mothers held up photographs of sons stolen by fentanyl overdoses, their hands trembling as they begged not for vengeance, but for accountability. A former steelworker whispered to her, "We don't need bombs in the Caribbean, we need treatment beds here at home." In a church basement, she knelt with parents who had buried teenagers, the scent of stale coffee and candle wax mixing with sobs. She promised them she would not let their pain be twisted into a weapon for political theater. Every handshake, every tear, hardened her resolve and sharpened her voice into something more than outrage. It became a vow. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance staged his own rallies beneath spotlights and banners screaming law and order. He pumped his fist as crowds chanted his name, selling the strike as a triumph of strength, mocking his critics as apologists for thugs. His stagecraft was perfect for the cameras, flags rippling, slogans thundering, his jaw clenched in defiance. The contrast was brutal. Crockett among the broken-hearted, Vance bathing in cheers. The split-screen image played on every network, a duel of narratives unfolding before a nation already torn in half. Yet beneath the roar of speeches, rumors spread like wildfire. A staffer from the Pentagon had whispered about a video grainy, damning footage to capture what really happened that night on the water. The whispers reached journalists, then activists, then Jasmine herself. The very possibility of its existence sent a shiver through Washington, because if the tape was real, it wouldn't just be evidence, it would be an indictment. Vance's camp dismissed it as conspiracy chatter, but the buzz refused to die. The country began holding its breath, waiting to see what would surface under the relentless lights of the hearing. The cameras rolled as Jasmine entered the Capitol, the weight of grieving families and the whispers of buried truth pressing against her shoulders. She carried a folder thick with documents, but it was the printout in her hand that froze the room when she lifted it high. Vance's own words, black and bold, projected on screens across America. "I don't give a damn what you call it." Her voice rang like a verdict. "This is Exhibit A." The chamber erupted in shouts. The press gallery crackled like gunfire, and millions leaned closer to their televisions. And in that single moment, the question hanging over America sharpened into a blade. Will the nation confront the darkness revealed before its eyes, or will it turn away and pretend not to see? The chamber pulsed like a pressure cooker, rows of lawmakers rigid in their seats, a forest of microphones glowing red, the staccato crack of camera shutters ricocheting off marble walls. A silence fell so sharp it seemed the air itself held its breath. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, eyes fixed on the vice president sitting opposite her, his posture casual, his smirk rehearsed. She didn't waste a second on ceremony. Her voice struck like a whip. "This is not leadership. This is lawlessness. You turned the U.S. military into an execution squad without trial, without authority, without shame." Gasps rippled through the chamber, reporters scribbled frantically, and television audiences leaned forward. Knowing the storm had begun, J.D. Vance leaned back in his chair, smirk deepening as though her fury only fed him. He tapped the table twice, then let his words drip with contempt. "At least I'm protecting Americans, not cartel trash. You can grandstand about due process, but while you talk, people die. I'll choose strength over weakness every time." His tone was casual, but the venom underneath it turned stomachs. Some in the gallery muttered in approval, others hissed in disbelief. The clash of worldviews was naked now, no pretense left. Jasmine stepped forward, hands braced on the table, her glare cutting through his bravado. "Strength," she shot back, her voice tightening into steel. "You confuse courage with cowardice. True strength means facing enemies in daylight, with law and justice on your side. You're a coward hiding behind bombs, pressing a button from a safe room while unarmed young men die on a boat with no chance to speak." The words detonated in the chamber. Several lawmakers gasped audibly, and one journalist whispered, "She said it, she called him a coward." Vance's face twitched, the smirk faltering for the first time. He gripped the microphone, his voice dropping into a growl. "Careful, Crockett, you think your insults make you brave. They make you reckless. The American people want safety, and I gave it to them." His words were meant to steady himself, but his jaw clenched tight betrayed the hit he had taken. Jasmine didn't back down. Her voice slowed, measured, every syllable deliberate. "Safety bought with lawlessness is no safety at all. It is terror disguised as order. And the only Americans who should fear justice are the ones who abuse power to cover their own crimes." Her final word cracked like glass, and for a heartbeat the chamber seemed to freeze, suspended in the raw collision of fury and arrogance. The camera zoomed tighter, catching every flicker of anger, every bead of sweat. This wasn't debate, it was combat, with words sharpened into weapons. Outside, protesters roared so loudly their chants leaked into the chamber, a reminder that the nation was listening to every word. And as the first round of their duel ended, a question burned across every screen, daring the audience to choose a side. What happens when truth meets brute force? Jasmine leaned into the microphone, her voice clipped and unrelenting, the chamber air so tight it felt combustible. 75 to 80% of those deported to El Salvador under this administration had no criminal record, no charges, no trials, just families ripped apart and innocent people branded as monsters. That's not security, it's state-sanctioned roulette. She held up a sheet of raw numbers, the black ink screaming louder than her voice, and the gallery erupted into a wave of uneasy murmurs. Some lawmakers shifted in their seats. Others looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Captain Miller, crisp in his uniform, stepped forward, every movement drilled by decades of service. He saluted before speaking, the silence sharp enough to slice through the camera's hum. "With respect, Madam Chair, drug interdiction is the Coast Guard's mission. Not the Pentagon's. We intercept, we detain, and we deliver suspects to the courts. That's the law, that's the protocol, that's the oath, but this strike bypassed us completely. No coordination, no chain of command, no legal order we could trace. In 25 years, I have never seen such a breach." His words didn't echo, they detonated. Gasps scattered across the hearing room, and for the first time, Vance shifted uncomfortably, the polished veneer cracking under the weight of uniformed authority. Then came Linda Hayes, her grief filling the chamber heavier than any statistic or regulation. A Gold Star mother with trembling hands clutched a framed photo of her son in uniform, his eyes frozen forever in the prime of his youth. Her voice was steady but laced with pain, sharp enough to wound. "My son died in Iraq," she said, her words rolling slow and deliberate, "and they told me his sacrifice was for democracy, for justice, for a country that followed the law. Don't you dare turn my son's death into an excuse for endless killing. If America forgets the difference between justice and slaughter, then what did my boy die for?" Her final words cracked, and the entire chamber seemed to bow beneath the weight of her grief. Lawmakers stared at the floor. Journalists dropped their pens. Even the cameras, relentless as they were, lingered long on her face as if reluctant to cut away from truth in its rawest form. Jasmine let the silence stretch before she spoke again, her voice low, carrying both fury and reverence. "We've heard the numbers, we've heard the protocol, we've heard a mother's broken heart, and all point to the same truth. This wasn't justice, it was lawlessness in uniform. It was power unchained." Her words rose sharper now, her eyes locked on Vance. "So the question is simple, Mr. Vice President, faced with evidence, authority, and grief, will you back down or will you double down and drag this nation deeper into the abyss?" The dam finally burst. J.D. Vance slammed his fist on the table, his voice breaking into a roar that shook the chamber. "You'd rather cry for thugs than defend your people. Every second you waste on sympathy is another American buried because of fentanyl. You stand with criminals, I stand with America." His words echoed like gunfire, half the room erupting in applause, the other half recoiling in disgust. The camera zoomed tight, catching the veins bulging at his temples, his mask of composure shattered. Jasmine didn't flinch, she snatched a stack of documents from her folder and slammed them onto the table with a crack that made the microphone squeal. Her voice was steel, her words slicing clean through his fury. 3 of the dead were under 21. No records, no trials, no chance to speak, just smoke, fire, and silence at the bottom of the sea. You call them cartel trash. I call them human beings denied justice, "I, the very man who swore an oath to protect it." The gallery gasped, and even some of Vance's allies shifted uneasily in their seats. For the first time, the vice president's narrative wavered under the weight of fact and fire. Rand Paul leaned forward, his voice low but cutting, the chamber stilling to hear him. "This is despicable and thoughtless," he declared, his words landing heavier than any insult. "You can't call yourself a leader if your solution is to kill first and question never. That's not bravery, it's barbarism." The silence that followed was electric, the kind of pause where the air feels like it might ignite. Vance turned on him like a cornered animal, eyes blazing. "Shut up, Paul. You're a relic, a coward hiding behind dusty books while I'm out here fighting a war. You'd rather watch this country burn than lift a damn finger to stop it." Spittle hit the mic as his voice cracked into rage. The chamber dissolved into chaos, gasps, shouts, the thrum of reporters hounding out headlines in real time. The Vice President of the United States had just told a sitting senator to shut up, live on national television. Jasmine rose slowly, her composure an ice blade against Vance's inferno. She let the nose wash around her, then reached into her folder with deliberate calm. When her hand emerged, it held not another paper, but a small, gleaming USB drive pinched between two fingers. She lifted it high, her eyes never leaving Vance's. "You talk about protecting America, you talk about strength. But strength isn't measured in tweets or tantrums, it's measured in truth. And I have footage you'll want to see." The chamber froze, breaths caught midair, every camera lens zooming so tight you could see the reflection of the drive in her nails. The room had been a battlefield of words, but now it felt like the opening of a trial, a reckoning that could not be shouted away. The question burned through the silence, gripping every viewer across the country. "What's on the tape?" The lights dimmed, the monitors flickered, and suddenly, the chamber was no longer marble wood but ocean and sky. A drone's eye view cut across the water, shaky but merciless, the black silhouette of a small vessel slicing against the waves. For 3 long seconds, the boat was just a boat. Then came the roar of missiles streaking down, the screen erupting in fire, the sea swallowing men and metal in the same instant. The sound of screaming bled through the speakers, thin, desperate, unforgettable. The chamber gasped as one, a sound that carried the shock of a nation watching truth they were never meant to see. Jasmine raised her hand and froze the frame mid-chaos. On screen, 3 figures clung to the deck, young men scrambling not with guns, but with bare hands, shielding their faces from the fire about to consume them. Their terror was captured forever in digital stillness, a tableau of lives snatched. Before they had begun, reporters scrambled to push updates. Phones buzzed on every desk, headlines detonated across networks in real time. Unarmed youths among dead. The gallery erupted with cries, some muffled, others shouted outright, "Murder, cover-up, justice." The hearing room had turned into a courtroom of the world. J.D. Vance leaned into his microphone, face pale but jaw set, muttering to words that would haunt him beyond the chamber. "Collateral damage." The phrase hung in the air like a curse, a sterile justification in the face of burning flesh. The chamber froze, then erupted again, this time not in gasps but in outrage. Senators exchanged glances, aides whispered frantically, and the gallery's roar became thunder. Jasmine's voice cut through the uproar, sharp and trembling with rage. "Collateral damage," she repeated, slamming her hand onto the table. These weren't statistics on a spreadsheet, these were human lives. Sons, brothers, children who will never go home. And you call them collateral as if their blood is just the cost of your political theater. Her words didn't echo, they seared. Even those who had cheered Vance earlier now sat stiff, unwilling to meet her gaze. The drone footage remained frozen behind her, 3 young faces lit by the glow of the blast that ended them. Cameras captured it from every angle, broadcasting the image to millions across America. It was no longer an argument, it was evidence. No longer a clash of opinions, it was truth. The chamber's tension rose to a fever pitch, every heartbeat drumming with the weight of what had been revealed. Protesters outside the Capitol grew louder, their chants rattling the windows. Justice, not war crimes. Inside, even silence was violent, and as Jasmine lowered her hand from the still frame, her voice steadied into a blade. America has seen the footage. America has heard the screams. The question now is not whether this was wrong, it's how a nation built on law will react when confronted with horror in real time. The chamber hadn't recovered from the frozen image of three terrified young men before J.D. Vance lunged for the microphone, his voice rising above the chaos. "Cartels use human shields," he barked, stabbing the air with his finger. "You think those boys were innocent? They were cover, they were bait. This is how cartels operate: hide behind children, then cry foul when America strikes back." His tone dripped with certainty, his jaw clenched like a man daring anyone to call him a liar. For a split second, some in the chamber hesitated, the words worming their way into doubt. Jasmine snapped around, her voice like a whip cracking across marble. "Then prove it," she demanded, slamming her palm onto the table so hard the microphones shook. "Where's your evidence? Where are the files? Where are the intercepts, the intelligence reports, the testimony of anyone who can back up your excuse? Show America that those young men were anything but unarmed, anything but human." The silence that followed was louder than any applause. Vance blinked, opened his mouth, then shut it, his smirk wobbling as the weight of her challenge pressed down. Dr. Elena Ruiz leaned into her microphone, her face lit with a controlled fury, her legal briefs spread like weapons across the desk. "Vice President Vance," she said, her tone scalpel sharp, "even if they were cartel-affiliated, no authorization for use of military force, no law passed by Congress permits this kind of extrajudicial killing. This strike was not authorized. This strike was illegal, and in the eyes of international law, this strike may qualify as a war crime." The words war crime landed like thunder, rattling through the chamber, through the airwaves, through living rooms across the country. Reporters scrambled to beam them across headlines. "Expert. Strike illegal. Maybe war crime." Outside the Capitol, the crowd swelled into a storm. Chants grew so loud they rattled the chamber doors. "Justice, not war crimes. Justice, not war crimes." The sound rolled like a tidal wave, feeding the energy inside, reminding everyone that the nation's eyes were not just watching but screaming. Yet within homes across America, the debate tore families apart, some shaking their heads at the footage, others repeating Vance's claim about human shields. Fear, once planted, was hard to uproot. Doubt seeped in, threading its way through the outrage, testing the strength of truth against the pull of terror. Jasmine's gaze swept the chamber, her voice lowering into something both furious and pleading. "You cannot scare a nation into surrendering its conscience. You cannot bomb your way to justice. And if you think fear will bury the truth, remember, truth always digs its way back to the surface." Her eyes locked on Vance, her words like a final nail in the table between them. "So the question we face is not whether this was a crime, the evidence is already here. The question is whether America will let fear bury the truth, or whether truth can still win against fear." The chamber quivered with tension, every camera light glowing like an executioner's torch. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, searing blade. "You want to play God," she said, each word deliberate, cutting through the clamor, "but God doesn't need your bombs." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the rustle of papers and the faint, rhythmic pounding of protesters outside. J.D. Vance's face twisted, the smirk replaced by something raw, something feral. He gripped the microphone so hard his knuckles whitened, and when he spoke, it came out as a snarl. "Deader God than weakling, better feared than forgotten. At least I have the guts to do what you and your bleeding heart allies never could." His voice cracked on the last word, but the venom remained, spraying across the chamber like shrapnel. Jasmine straightened, her eyes locked on him with surgical precision. "Deader law than tyranny," she shot back, her tone rising like a gavel crashing down. "Because tyranny dies the moment law stands tall. And what you've done isn't leadership, it's the reckless tantrum of a man who thinks he can bend justice to his will." Her words sliced the air, and for the first time, Vance looked shaken, blinking against the force of her conviction. Gasps surged through the room as aides leaned into one another, whispering furiously, reporters clattering at their keyboards, the sound like machine gun fire of truth being written in real time. Vance tried to recover, tried to steady his breathing, but the image behind Jasmine, frozen footage of three young men on the deck before the blast, loomed over him like a judgment he could not escape. Then Jasmine did what no one expected. She stood, slow and deliberate, and raised her hand to point directly at the vice president. Her voice thundered now, echoing off marble, reverberating through the airwaves, slamming into the millions watching at home. "Tomorrow, you answer under oath. No spin, no excuses, no hiding behind fear. You will answer for the blood on your hands, The chamber exploded, gasps, shouts, cameras flashing so fast it looked like lightning storming indoors. Vance's mouth opened, but no sound came. The protesters outside erupted louder, their chants shaking the very glass panes. Justice! 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 Jasmine lowered her hand, her gaze still locked, her voice soft now but deadlier than before. Pray for your words, Mr. Vice President. Because tomorrow, the country will finally decide if you're a leader or a liar, and, as the gavel slammed, the hook hold around the nation's throat, impossible to ignore, will he survive another day of questioning? The room had grown so tense it felt like glass about to crack. Jasmine Crockett rose again, her face framed by the glow of monitors still frozen on the drone strike's aftermath. She leaned into her mic, her tone a razor wrapped in velvet. Mr. Vice President, I will ask you plainly, and America will hear your answer. Do you have congressional authority for this strike, yes or no? The words dropped like a hammer, reverberating across the chamber, ricocheting through television screens into living rooms across the country. The camera operator instinctively pushed in, the lens tightening until Vance's face filled the nation's vision. A bead of sweat glistened at his temple, his jaw clenched so hard it tremored. He opened his mouth, then closed it, eyes flicking to the ceiling, then back to Jasmine's unflinching stare. That's when the stopwatch appeared in her hand, its metallic click echoing like the pull of a trigger. She pressed start, and the countdown began. 10 seconds. The chamber sat frozen, as if oxygen had been stolen from the air. Reporters leaned so far forward they looked ready to topple from the press benches. Protesters outside stilled for a beat, chants choking into silence as if the whole city were holding its breath. Jasmine did not blink. Vance's lips twitched, but no words emerged. 20 seconds, aides whispered frantically behind him, passing notes that he ignored. The gallery stirred, some gasping, some shaking their heads. On live TV, networks split the screen. Vance's face on one side, the stopwatch numbers ticking mercilessly on the other. Millions watched, hands gripping armrests, waiting for the sound that would not come. 30-5 seconds. The silence was no longer absence, it was nose, deafening and suffocating. A senator coughed just to remind the room sounds still existed. Jasmine leaned in closer, her voice soft but cutting. You see, silence is its own answer. Every second you sit mute is a confession to the American people. Vance's eyes flared, but still he said nothing, trapped in the cage he built himself. 47 seconds. The beep of the stopwatch pierced the chamber like a siren. It was over. Jasmine's arm dropped, the device still glowing in her hand. The gallery erupted in gasps, shouts, and a wave of disbelief that rolled through the chamber like an earthquake. Headlines blasted across phones within seconds. 47 seconds of silence. VP Vance fails to answer. Jasmine straightened, her words landing like a verdict etched in stone. No authority, no law, no defense, just silence, and in the face of power, silence speaks louder than any lie. And as the cameras captured the moment in unflinching detail, one question echoed across the nation, sharp enough to slice through every living room. What does silence mean in the face of power? The chamber had barely recovered from the final beep of Jasmine's stopwatch, and the headlines detonated across every glowing screen. 47 seconds of silence. VP Vance stunned, news ticker scrolled in blazing red, anchors speaking with the urgency of wartime dispatches. Some outlets replayed the footage on loop, the camera zooming on his frozen face as the seconds bled away. Others split the screen, Jasmine's piercing glare on one side, Vance's speechless collapse on the other. It wasn't just a hearing anymore, it was history in the making, broadcast in real time. Within minutes, social media ignited like dry tinder. Hashtags trended across platforms. Hashtag for 7 seconds of silence. Hashtag justice not bombs. Hashtag Vance frozen. TikTok flooded with edits of the silence set to ominous music, teenagers timing themselves to see how long 47 seconds really felt when the world was watching. Twitter. X became a battlefield, one camp crowning Jasmine a hero who broke the vice president without firing a shot, the other scrambling to spin the silence as strategic restraint. That the raw clip spoke louder than any caption. A man with the world's most powerful office asked a simple question, and unable to answer. Inside the chamber, Jasmine's supporters exchanged tight smiles, their relief restrained but electric. A senator whispered to a colleague, That might be the moment everything shifts. Across the aisle, Vance's allies scrambled, their whispers frantic, eyes darting at one another as if searching for an emergency exit that didn't exist. The sound of camera shutters drowned out the murmurs, immortalizing every flicker of panic, every forced smile, every twitch of denial. Vance himself sat stiff, his mask fracturing under the lights. His eyes darted from the stopwatch still glowing in Jasmine's hand to the frozen drone image looming behind her. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, the confidence that once powered his words now curdling into visible rage. He slammed his palm against the table as if trying to break the silence retroactively, but the damage was already done. Fear flickered at the edge of his expression, the kind that no smirk or slogan could hide. For the first time, the Vice President of the United States looked cornered, small, human and desperate. Outside the Capitol, the chants grew thunderous, shaking the very glass panes. 47 seconds. 47 seconds. Protesters waved signs painted in blood-red letters. Families of fentanyl victims stood shoulder to shoulder with veterans. Civil rights leaders marched alongside young activists. America's fractures had found a new rallying cry, a silence that united outrage across every dividing line. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, eyes never leaving Vance, her composure unshaken. She didn't need to say another word, the silence had already spoken for him. The gavel slammed, but its sound was drowned by the echoes of that unanswered question, reverberating far beyond the walls of Congress. And as the clip replayed endlessly, looping through the bloodstream of the nation, one question grew sharper with every broadcast, every retweet, every whisper. Will this silence end his career or fuel his fire into something even darker? The echoes of the gavel still lingered when Senator Rand Paul leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of a rare alignment. He didn't hedge, didn't soften the blow. For once, I stand with Jasmine Crockett, he declared, his tone slicing through the chamber's nose. No one is above the law, not a president, not a vice president, not anyone who thinks silence can cover blood on their hands. The words dropped like lead, reverberating across the marble, drawing gasps from those who never expected to hear a Republican senator side so bluntly with his fiercest Democratic colleague. Cameras swung instantly, snapping the stunned faces of Vance's allies as if history itself had shifted mid-sentence. Jasmine, still posed but burning with momentum, rose for what would be her last strike of the day. She didn't shout, she didn't need to. Her voice was a low ember, steady and dangerous. Silence is not strength, silence is surrender. And, today, the American people saw what surrender looks like. She let the words hang, to silence after them heavier than any outburst, her gaze sweeping across the chamber, locking on Vance for one final time before she turned away. That silence, the one she controlled, spoke volumes more than the silence that had just destroyed him. Outside the Capitol, the aftershocks hit like tremors rolling through a fractured country. Pollsters scrambled to release flash surveys, and, within hours the results flashed across networks, support for Vance plunging 5-10 points. Undecideds tilting toward Crockett's demand for accountability. Hashtags hardened into movements, protest chants into nightly vigils, and pundits began to whisper that the hearing wasn't just a skirmish, it was the start of a reckoning. On talk radio, callers, who once defended Vance, now admitted they couldn't stomach the silence. By nightfall, anchors across ideological lines repeated the same phrase. The vice president cracked on live television. But the storm wasn't over, it was only gathering force. Just as the chamber began to empty, a journalist's phone buzzed, with a notification that would set the next stage ablaze. A leaked memo, allegedly from Pentagon legal advisors, suggested deep unease about the strike. The language was chilling in its bluntness. Unclear authority, potential violation. Recommend review before action. If authentic, it wasn't just a political scandal, it was evidence that even the military's own counsel had doubts before the missile ever left its wing. Reporters bolted for cameras, staffers whispered furiously in corners, and Jasmine's team exchanged glances that said everything. The silence had already broken Vance's armor, but this leak could pierce his heart. Across the country, television crawls teased the next chapter. Pentagon warned. Memo leaks raised new questions. The hearing had ended, but the nation was still on the edge of its seat. And as Americans scrolled, argued, and demanded answers, one question now loomed larger than all the rest, a question that could decide the fate of a vice president and the credibility of an entire administration. What did the Pentagon know? And high. The leak dropped like a bombshell at midnight, splashed across front pages before dawn. Pentagon Papers. Lawyers warn strike come lawful. Inside the report were memos stamped with urgent red ink, written by military legal advisors who had raised alarms days before the attack. Their words were blunt, stripped to politics, no clear authority. Potential violation of U.S. and international law. Recommend delay pending review. But the strike happened anyway, and 11 bodies now floated in history's ledger. The country woke to the revelation that the vice president had not acted in ignorance, he had acted in defiance. By morning, Jasmine Crockett stood in the chamber holding one of the memos high, her voice trembling with outrage but steady with conviction. You ignored your own lawyers, you ignored the warnings. You knew this strike was unlawful, and you ordered it anyway. She slammed the paper onto the table, its pages rattling like thunder, the word unlawful underlined so many times it tore through the page. Camera zoomed in on the single damning sentence, recommend delay pending review. The image would become iconic, replayed on loop across every news network. JD Vance leaned forward, his voice gravelly, his face pale under the lights. We had to act, he spat, his words rushing, his tone defensive, almost desperate. If we had waited, more poison would have flowed into American veins. More families would have buried their children. Action was the only choice. He tried to inject strength into the statement, but the strain in his voice betrayed him. The gallery shifted uneasily, because the subtext was louder than his excuse. If he could brush off legal counsel once, he could do it again. Fear crept through the chamber like a chill. Senators exchanged glances that carried more than shock, they carried dread. If the Vice President of the United States could override the Pentagon's own legal warnings, then what barrier remained? What law? What constitution? What safeguard could hold him in check the next time he decided to act? On television, commentators spoke to fear aloud. If he can ignore his own lawyers, what's next? Ignoring Congress, ignoring the courts, ignoring the people. The question gnawed at the country like acid, eating away trust hour by hour. Outside, protests swelled into chaos. Signs reading law, not dictatorship, and no one above the Constitution. The chant shifted from anger to fear, the voices less defiant, more urgent. If he can do this, one protester said into a camera, then none of us are safe from the next decision he makes. Even his supporters began to falter, their defenses of strength now shadowed by the realization that unchecked strength quickly curdles into tyranny. Jasmine's voice cut through the tension once more, sharper than ever. Her eyes locked on Vance. If the law means nothing to you, then the only limit on your power is whatever you decide in the dark of night. That is not democracy, it is dictatorship in a suit. Her words struck like a verdict, leaving the chamber reeling, the nation staring into a dangerous abyss. And as the clip spread, replayed on every phone and television, one question consumed the air like smoke, impossible to escape. How far will he go unchecked? The hearing had barely adjourned before the airwaves turned into a battlefield. CNN played the 47 seconds of silence on loop, anchors dissecting every twitch of Vance's jaw, every bead of sweat that betrayed his panic. MSNBC's Chiron screamed across the bottom of the screen. Vice President stunned into silence. Legal memos ignore. Meanwhile, Fox News went on the offensive, flipping the narrative with relentless precision. Their primetime hosts thundered. Jasmine Crockett is soft on crime, she'd rather hug criminals and protect American families. Clips of grieving fentanyl victims were intercut with sound bites of Jasmine demanding due process, twisted into an accusation that she cared more about cartel rights than community safety. But Jasmine wasn't about to let the narrative calcify. That same night, she walked into a CNN studio, her fire undimmed. Soft on crime, she shot back, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. I'm not soft, I'm smart on justice. Justice means stopping fentanyl at its source and protecting the Constitution at home. Justice means taking down cartels without turning America into the very tyranny we claim to fight. The clip went viral, her phrase smart on justice, flooding Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram Reels, transforming what Fox intended as an insult into a rallying cry. Still, Jasmine knew words alone couldn't win this war. The next morning, she stepped into a battered community center on the outskirts of Philadelphia, where fentanyl's grip was carved into every face. Mothers clutched photos of children, lost, their voices trembling with anger and despair. A father spoke of burying two sons in the same year, his hands shaking as he gripped a worn baseball cap that once belonged to his eldest. Jasmine didn't stand at a podium, she sat with them, shoulder to shoulder, listening. Tears welled in her eyes as one mother asked the question that cut deeper than any headline. If law doesn't protect us, what does? She took a breath, steadying her voice against the wave of grief around her. You deserve a government that fights cartels with precision, not recklessness. You deserve leaders who will bring treatment, prevention, and accountability, not missiles launched in the dark. I promise you this, I will fight the poison of fentanyl with every tool we have, but I will also fight the poison of lawlessness at the highest levels of power, because both are killing us. Cameras captured the moment, the room heavy with sorrow, but electrified with the promise of defiance. Outside, reporters pressed against the windows, capturing chants from activists who had picked up her words and turned them into a slogan: smart on justice, strong on truth. Poll numbers began to shift again, the country starting to see Jasmine not just as a fighter in Congress, but as a warrior standing with the people. And as she left the community center, surrounded by families who carried both grief and hope in equal measure, one question lingered in the air, sharper than ever: can she turn grief into action? The storm had barely begun to settle when a darker cloud ripped across the sky of American politics. Late in the evening, news outlets interrupted programming with a chilling headline: leaked audio, VP Vance mocks victims. The recording, grainy but unmistakable, crackled through every speaker in the nation. J.D. Vance's voice dripped with contempt. Crimea River. These families trot out their tears, but at the end of the day, weakness doesn't save America. Strength does, and I'll never apologize for it. The words landed like shrapnel in living rooms from coast to coast. Within minutes, outrage detonated online. Hashtags that had simmered now exploded into firestorms. Hashtag Crimea River. Hashtag Vance exposed. Hashtag justice over cruelty. Clips of grieving parents from Jasmine's town halls were paired with the audio, the juxtaposition so brutal it left audiences stunned. On MSNBC, anchors spoke with trembling disbelief. CNN's Chiron blared. VP Vance mocks Gold Star mothers. Even Fox, loyal just days earlier, hesitated. One commentator muttered, "This may be indefensible." The shift was seismic, outrage no longer partisan, but national. In the Capitol, Republican senators paced in private halls, some with faces pale as chalk. Staffers whispered of phones ringing off the hook, donors demanding answers, pastors from conservative congregations calling Vance's words blasphemous. One lawmaker muttered to a reporter off camera, "He just set himself on fire." Even his allies began to retreat, their public statements suddenly cautious, their eyes calculating whether loyalty to Vance was now a death sentence for their own careers. Jasmine moved swiftly, her fury sharpened into purpose. She entered the chamber the next morning with the leaked audio already queued for replay. "Let America hear the truth," she declared, pressing play. The room froze as Vance's mocking tone filled the air, echoing off marble. "Impossible to dismiss." Gasps rose from the gallery. Some lawmakers bowed their heads, others shook in disbelief. Jasmine's voice sliced in right as the recording ended. "That is the man entrusted with protecting your families. A man who laughs at mothers burying their children. A man who calls grief weakness." Her words rang like a gavel striking bone. Vance tried to retort, but his face betrayed him, flushed, jaw tight, eyes darting as though searching for an exit that didn't exist. The chamber roared with disapproval, a weight so fierce it rattled the air. Jasmine seized the moment, her voice thunderous. "This nation deserves leaders who fight with integrity, not cruelty. I am introducing a motion to censure Vice President Vance for conduct unbecoming of any American official, let alone the second highest office in the land." Reporters sprang to their feet, cameras flashing like lightning, the words "motion to censure" blazing across headlines within seconds. The chamber erupted into chaos, voices clashing, alliances fracturing in real time. Outside, protesters swelled to tens of thousands, chanting Jasmine's words back at the marble steps: "Not weakness, justice." The nation teetered on the edge of something unthinkable, and Jasmine had just lit the fuse. The gavel slammed, but the nose code not drown the question now burning across America: can she pull off the unthinkable? The chamber was a battlefield before the first word was spoken. Every seat filled, every camera trained, Every senator and representative knowing history was about to carve its mark in real time. The motion to censure the Vice President of the United States was on the table, and the weight of it pressed on the air like a storm waiting to break. The whispers were sharp, alliances brittle, and no one could predict which way the tide would turn. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, her hand brushing the worn pocket constitution she carried like armor. The silence was total, the kind that prickled against skin. Her voice came low at first, then surged with fire that licked the corners of the chamber. This isn't partisan, it's patriotic. Censure is not about Democrats or Republicans, it's about the rule of law. It's about saying that in America, no man, no office, no vice president stands above the Constitution. If we fail this test, then what we lose isn't an election, it's the soul of the republic. Her words rose into thunder, shaking the walls, drawing applause from corners that rarely clapped for her. J.D. Vance leaned back, his smirk returning like a mask hastily reapplied. He let out a laugh that glared like nails on steel. "You're nothing but a loudmouth," he sneered, leaning into his mic so the insult would carry. "All talk, no action, a grandstanding opportunist who would rather shame her own government than defend it. You don't scare me, your background knows." The chamber erupted in murmurs, some in shock, others in anger, the insult slicing across the room. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her palm slamming onto the table with the crack of a gavel. Better a loudmouth for justice than a silent accomplice to murder. Her voice soared over the chamber, over the protests outside, over the weight of history itself. The line landed with the force of a verdict. Gasps followed, then a ripple of applause that grew until even the galleries shook. Vance's face tightened, his jaw rigid, the sneer gone, his eyes betraying the flicker of unease that silence had already carved into him days before. The debate raged on around them, lawmakers rising and falling like waves, some demanding loyalty, others demanding accountability. News alerts flashed in real time, poll numbers sliding further away from Vance, hashtags flooding every screen. Outside, the chants of protesters became a deafening drumbeat. Justice, not silence. Justice, not silence. The gavel struck again, calling the chamber to order. The clerk prepared the roll. Every heartbeat in the room thudded louder than the last. America leaned forward, millions glued to screens, the weight of decision balanced on a knife's edge. And, as Jasmine's words still hung in the air like smoke after a blast, the question thundered through every corner of the nation. Who will Congress side with? The streets of America roared louder than the walls of Congress. In Chicago, tens of thousands surged down Michigan Avenue, their chants pounding against skyscrapers. Justice, not assassination. In New York, Times Square became a sea of candles and cardboard signs, faces lit by the words scrawled in red paint. No one above the law. In Miami, Cuban-American families marched with portraits of loved ones lost to violence, demanding that America not answer tragedy with tyranny. Helicopters circled overhead, cameras beaming the uprisings into homes already vibrating with anger. Inside the Capitol, the hearing room overflowed with testimony that pierced deeper than any statistic. A Marine veteran stood tall, medals pinned to his chest, voice breaking as he declared, "I fought for a country that believed in trials, not executions. If we abandon that, then every flag on every coffin I've carried was for nothing." An immigrant father from Guatemala raised a trembling hand, explaining through a translator that his teenage son was among those deported under false pretenses. They called him a criminal. He was a student. He never came home. His words cracked into sobs that silenced even the most hardened lawmakers. Then came a mother clutching a folded American flag, her voice so steady, chilled the room. "My son died, wearing this uniform. Don't let men in suits dishonor his sacrifice by mocking law itself." The camera lingered on their faces, unblinking, forcing the country to confront grief unfiltered. The chants outside bled into the broadcast, their rhythm unrelenting, the sound of a nation pounding on the doors of its own government. The narrator's voice cut in, not as commentary, but as a challenge. "If it were your son on that boat, your child caught in the blast, what would you demand?" Justice or silence, the question hung like a blade over every viewer, daring then to answer. Lawmakers shifted uneasily in their seats, their phones buzzing with lev polls showing support for censure climbing by the hour. Even those who had vowed loyalty to Vance could feel the ground tilting beneath them. The weight of public fury was no longer abstract, it was outside their windows, flooding their inboxes. scrawled on signs carried by veterans and mothers and immigrants who refused to be erased. And as the chants rattled the very glass of the chamber, the tension sharpened into a single question that burned hotter with every passing second. Will public pressure tip the scales? The roll call felt like a drumbeat of destiny, each name echoing across the chamber with the weight of a nation on edge. One by one, lawmakers declared their votes, the tally flickering on the giant board like the pulse of America itself. Protesters outside held their breath, chants dying into silence as the numbers climbed closer to the threshold. Cameras zoomed in on faces twisted with tension, some sweating, some praying, some already calculating their futures in the ashes of this moment. Then it was over. The motion to censure Vice President J.D. Vance had failed by only a handful of votes. Guests erupted, the sound of heartbreak crashing against marble walls. For Vance, it was survival, but not triumph. He leaned back in his chair, a hollow smile twitching at the corner of his mouth, but the relief was laced with panic. The nation had seen him silenced, mocked, exposed, and now spared by inches. His victory was thin, his power bleeding in plain sight. Jasmine rose, her eyes locked on him, her voice calm but lethal. "You may survive today," she declared, each word cutting deeper than any gavel, "but truth will outlast your lies. Tower built on silence and cruelty cannot stand forever." The chamber stirred, her words searing themselves into headlines within seconds. Outside, the crowd that had braced for triumph now erupted in fury, then resolve, chanting louder than before. "Truth will outlast! Truth will outlast!" It was an emotional whiplash, despair at the vote's failure, yet a surge of hope in the sheer closeness of it. For millions watching, the narrow margin proved momentum was shifting, that Jasmine's crusade had shaken the foundations of power. Even those who doubted her now whispered that she had carved something irreversible into the political bloodstream. And then came the whisper that electrified every newsroom. Reports that Venezuela and the United Nations were preparing to condemn, to strike, possibly even demand accountability on the world stage. The survival Vance had clawed in Congress could collapse under international fire. As the gavel struck and the chamber emptied into chaos, one question burned hotter than the vote itself. Will the world now step in? The fallout crossed oceans before Congress had even adjourned. In New York, the United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session, the chamber filled with delegates whose eyes burned with outrage. Venezuela's ambassador pounded the table, voice quaking with fury. 11 of our citizens are dead. Not criminals, not combatants, human beings. And the United States dares to call them collateral damage. His words ricocheted across the room, translated into every tongue, broadcast into every capital. A demand rang clear. Accountability. The world press descended like vultures. London papers screamed America's dirty strike. French broadcasters called it une guerre sans eau, or without law. In Latin America, leaders warned of a precedent that could justify their own neighbors launching unilateral killings. Across Asia and Africa, editorials mourned the America they once looked to as a beacon of justice, asking aloud if that beacon had gone dark. Overnight, the image of Vance sitting in silence for 47 seconds was replayed in languages he could not understand, but the meaning needed no translation. Weakness masquerading as power, arrogance exposed as lawlessness. Inside Congress, Jasmine Crockett rose again, not just to speak to Americans, but to the watching world. Her voice carried the gravity of a verdict. If America abandons law, what example do we set? If the most powerful nation on earth shrugs off rules written in blood after 2 world wars, then what do we leave behind but ashes? Every dictator who silences dissent, every tyrant who murders in the dark, will point to us and say, "They did it first." That cannot be our legacy. Her words were clipped into headlines within minutes, playing side by side with footage of protests erupting in Caracas, Madrid, and London. J.D. Vance attempted defiance, dismissing the UN as irrelevant bureaucrats, but his words only deepened the fracture. Allies who once shielded America now whispered of sanctions, inquiries, tribunals. The State Department scrambled, diplomats dispatched to soothe enraged capitals, but the tide had turned. America's enemies celebrated, America's friends hesitated. For the first time in decades, the world questioned whether Washington still had the moral authority to lead. Outside, protesters carried their signs not just in English but in Spanish, French, Arabic. Crowds filled the streets from Chicago to Caracas, chanting in unison for justice. The world had become Jasmine's stage, her demand for accountability amplified beyond borders. Even critics admitted she had shifted the conversation, her voice now standing as America's only thread of credibility in a storm of condemnation. And as the hearing recessed, as diplomats scrambled, as nations weighed consequences that could shake the globe, one question rose above the chaos, sharper and louder than the rest. Can one voice change a nation's course? The cameras unlev one last time, every network breaking into regular programming for the moment built as the final showdown. The nation watched, the world leaned in, as Jasmine Crockett and Vice President J.D. Vance faced each other across a table that had become an altar of judgment. The silence before the first word was thunderous, the kind of silence that carried millions of heartbeats inside it. Jasmine rose, her eyes blazing not with anger but with certainty. Her voice, calm yet devastating, cut through the tension. History will remember 47 seconds of silence when the Vice President of the United States could not answer whether he had the law on his side. But history will also remember me as the woman who made you answer, not with words. With the truth of your silence, the chamber erupted, the sound rolling like a wave crashing against stone. Applause and cheers bursting from the gallery, spilling into the streets where protesters were watching on giant screens. Vance tried to sneer, his lips curling as he spat into the microphone. You think applause changes the world. You think slogans outlive power, but his voice cracked. Beneath the roar, drowned out by the thunder of clapping hands, chants rising from outside, the sound of a nation choosing its witness. His sneer collapsed into something smaller, swallowed by the moment. Jasmine didn't flinch. She simply stood, letting the applause cascade over her, her gaze fixed forward as if she were already speaking to history itself. The lights burned hot, the cameras tighter than ever, immortalizing a clash that had torn open the soul of a country. And as the broadcast faded to black, one final question seared itself into the conscience of America. Whose legacy will endure? The lights of the chamber dimmed, but the story did not end there. Outside, the air was alive with chants, with the pounding rhythm of footsteps on pavement, with the electric hum of a country pulled to the edge of reckoning. Jasmine Crockett stepped through the heavy doors, not into silence but into the embrace of the people whose voices had carried her fight. Cameras followed as she moved deliberately, shaking the hands of veterans who stood ramrod straight despite scars that never healed. Mothers clutching photographs of children stolen by fentanyl or violence, workers with calloused palms who whispered gratitude through tears. Each grasp was a covenant, a reminder that her war was never about podiums or politics, it was about them. A narrator's voice cut through the noise, low and resonant, carrying the weight of the journey. A warrior for justice isn't defined by enemies defeated, but by lives defended. The images on screen shift to Jasmine with the families in Philadelphia, Jasmine holding the Pentagon memo aloft, Jasmine staring down a vice president silenced by 47 endless seconds. It was a tapestry of defiance, a record of one woman's refusal to let lawlessness task for leadership. The crowd parted slightly as Jasmine stopped on the Capitol steps, microphone swarming but ignored. She raised her head, her voice strong enough to slice through the storm. Justice doesn't belong to the powerful, it belongs to the people. The words ignited the square, chants roaring back like thunder, the phrase already etched into signs and hashtags before the sound had even faded. Then came the final beat, direct to the audience watching from couches and phones, a challenge that cut through the screen. What does justice mean to you today? Comment below, let your voice be heard. The broadcast closed not on despair, but on a spark hope sharpened into defiance, a nation left not with silence, but with a choice. True justice is never measured by the power we hold, but by the courage we show when defending those who cannot defend themselves. Jasmine's battle reminds us that silence in the face of wrongdoing is not neutrality, it is surrender. In our own lives, whether in our workplaces, families, or communities, we are called to speak up when fairness is threatened, even if our voices shake. Real strength is found not in domination, but in protecting dignity and truth. So I ask you, when injustice stands before you, will you choose silence or will you choose to speak? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.